I'm going to begin with a story. It's a story that I've used on retreats before, and I apologize for those of you who have been on those retreats with me for having to hear this again, but it really, I think, is a very profound story. There once was a young couple who had a 10-year-old son who didn't want to study Torah. And for them, this was a terrible problem because every 10-year-old little boy was studying Torah, but their little boy wanted to do what little boys do. And that was to go out into the field and to discover praying mantises and other insects and whatever it is that they do, to run in the fields and to just be a boy. But he didn't want to study Torah, and his parents wanted him to. So what were they to do? They went to their rabbi, and they said, "What are we to do? Our son will not study Torah." And he gave them some advice that they followed, but still the little boy would not study Torah. So then they went seeking advice from family and friends near and far, and they tried all of that advice out, still to no avail. The little boy would not study Torah, and they began to despair. And then word came that the greatest Hasidic Rebbe of their generation was going to be visiting their little shtetl. And so on the day that the rabbi arrived, a long line of people stood there waiting for his blessing. The childless, those who were disabled, those who had failed in business. In short, everyone in that shtetl stood in line with their life's greatest problems seeking healing. And there among them was our couple with their 10-year-old son. When at last they entered into the presence of the great Rebbe, they told him their whole story. And the Rebbe just sat behind the desk and looked first at the boy and then at the parents. And the boy just stood there defiantly, his gaze down, his arms folded, as we know little boys and girls can be. And the Rebbe's eyes turned to the parents, who looked nervously at the Rebbe and then at their son. And then the Rebbe spoke. "So he won't study Torah." He growled so loudly that the parents stepped closer to each other. "You leave him here for 2 hours. I will give him a good talking to, and he will study Torah. He will never forget." Well, the parents looked at each other in fear and wondered, should we leave him? This guy's kind of frightening. But the advice of everyone had failed. And so they left their little boy with their last chance, the Rebbe. And as soon as the parents had left, the Rebbe stood up and went up to the little boy, and he slowly, tenderly put his arms around the boy. Now the boy at first was very still, but then by degrees he allowed himself to be hugged. He dropped his arms to his side, relaxed the pout of his mouth, and was finally pulled against the breast of the great man. He stood there, hearing the heartbeat of the great Rebbe. Their breath flowed in and out together. This went on for 2 hours. And then the parents returned, and they asked, "Did it work?" Now they had no idea what had happened. "Did it work?" "You just wait and see," the Rebbe said, practically shouting. All the way home, the parents were wondering, is there a change in our son? Could there be a change in our son? They stopped at the butcher's, and the butcher slapped a piece of meat on the counter. "Mama, the butcher is angry, isn't he?" "I guess he is," she said. "Mama, what happened to him to make him feel that way?" Over the days that followed, the parents realized that their little boy was somehow more in touch with people, attuned to their feelings and interested in their stories. When he heard others discussing the stories in Torah, he realized these were stories about people, and he got interested. He was fascinated by them. What made people act the way that they did? Within a month, he asked to be allowed to learn how to read the stories for himself. The parents' prayers were answered. Within a year, his teachers saw him as their most talented student. In one way after another, the fire of Talmudic tradition began to glow brightly inside him. The boy grew in wisdom such that his friends, neighbors, and even adult villagers would bring their disagreements and quarrels to him, and he was able to help them find solutions that had always been there, only prevented by their fear and anger, allowing them to see it. When it was time for the boy to choose a profession, what else could he do? He became a Rebbe himself. And years later, when he was the greatest Rebbe of his generation, his disciples would sit around him and ask, "You are such a great scholar. How did you get such deep insight into Torah?" And he would say to them, "When did I learn to study Torah? When did I truly learn to study the Holy Torah? I learned everything when the great Rebbe held me silently against his breast." Our sixth word is healing. Reflecting on the deep listening of the Rebbe and the little boy's story, the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh has written, "Deep listening, compassionate listening, is not listening with the purpose of analyzing or even uncovering what has happened in the past. You listen first of all in order to give the other person relief, a chance to speak out, to feel that someone finally understands him or her. Deep listening is the kind of listening that helps us to keep compassion alive while the other speaks. Having laid our head on the breast of Christ in the Scriptures, we Dominicans are called to compassionate listening that allows others to lay their heads on our hearts, their heads on our shoulders, to place their hands in our hearts and know the loving, healing touch of Christ. In this preaching, in word and deed, we become the very face of God and bring healing to others' lives, not hell. Joy, not judgment. Let's take a moment with that word of healing.